Thank you, Anna. That was great. I hope people found that a useful run through the findings. I should have said when I started, the full report is being published tomorrow, but please do feel free to share any reflections from what you've heard today on social media and get the conversation going. We anticipate that people will have many things, many views to share. So I am now delighted to welcome our all-star panel who are going to initially share some reflections of their own, from their own kind of professional backgrounds and having had a chance to digest some of what's in the report. Each of them will do that. I'll introduce them first. Each of them will speak for a few minutes just to share those initial reflections, and then I'll kick off with a couple of my own questions, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. So by way of introduction, our panel, Dr. Daniela Jenkins, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol, where she leads work on design thinking and innovation in policy contexts, and her PhD examined how to design policies to reduce gender pensions gaps. Angela Sharma, who is a senior counsel for knowledge at Taylor Wessing, an international law firm. She has over 25 years experience in pensions. She provides specialist legal support, keeping her team and clients updated on legal and other relevant developments relating to pensions law. We have Nathan Mallows, Director of Finance, People and Change at Coastline Housing, who are based in Cornwall. Nathan started with Coastline at the start of 2016, has lived in Cornwall since late 2014. Coastline focus on solving the Cornwall housing crisis in all its forms. And part of this is being one of the top 10 fastest growing providers every year since 2017, providing one of only 2 affordable extra care schemes in the county and homelessness support services through a purpose-built facility. And finally, Zoe Alexander, who is the Executive Director of Policy and Advocacy at Pensions UK, which is many of you will be familiar with, but is a not-for-profit organisation that represents pension schemes that together provide a retirement income to more than 30 million savers in the UK and invest more than 1.3 trillion in the UK and abroad. And many of you will also know that prior to that, Zoe was my colleague at Nest, so it's lovely to have Zoe on the panel as well. So, as I said, we're going to give each of our panellists sort of 6 or 7 minutes, give or take, to just share some initial reflections and thoughts on the whole topic, and then we'll move into conversation. So, Daniela, can I ask you to kick us off?
Brilliant, thank you, Will. And firstly, I'd just like to thank you, Anna, the team. It's always great to see innovative thinking around pensions and challenging our assumptions around that. As anyone who's heard me before and those that might hear me in the future, normally I'm coming at it from the women's perspective, not least because I'm going to shortly become the executive director of the Women's Budget Group. So it won't surprise you if I start by talking about the fact that pensions are a gendered policy area. And that's evidence, so that's not just a sort of poor women. 54% of pensioners, people of pension age and above, are women. 57% of those living in poverty in retirement are women, and 34% of those are single women. So when we talk about pensions policy, we are talking about an area inevitably that will disproportionately affect women. We also know that there is a gender pensions gap. So if we look at 2023 figures from DWP, they estimated a 35% gender pensions gap. Now, very often that takes us straight into the space of people talking about childcare and women working part-time, but that is not an inevitable situation, and that is partly brought about by pensions design. I like to highlight the fact that the UK has the second worst gender pensions gap out of all of the OECD countries, only worsted by Japan. So there are things that can be done to improve that. And then at the same time, we know that housing is gendered. So if renting is to be affordable, we assume that you should have 30% of your income should go towards rent. But yet we know that within the UK, men have to, those at median income, have to allocate 42% of their income to be able to rent. And there's a big variation, as we know, in terms of what rental prices are across the UK. But for women, who earn less on average, then we know that median income for women have to allocate 58% of their income towards rent. Okay, so we know that there are already differentials. Then we move into home ownership. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of being a gendered outcome as well? Well, if we look at purchase income to price ratio, then for men, we know, even with our unaffordable housing, that equals 7. Right? So we're looking at a ratio of 7 times of what you need to earn in terms of price to your income. For women, that's 9 times, looking at women's medium median incomes. So housing is already, whether you rent or whether you own, it is less affordable for women across the piece. And we also know that women have smaller pension pots overall. So you would think that as a result of that, I would be all in favor of this, right? It makes sense, How we know that this is going to affect women. We know that women have challenges, women are more likely to be single as they get older, and that the affordability for single women in particular need to put approximately half of their earnings just to be able to rent a single, one-bedroom flat. But actually, my real challenge around this is that we're making a lot of assumptions about what a pension is and what a pension should be. And actually, if we think about a pension as just a saving scheme with a tax wraparound, then yeah, intuitively it makes sense. Why would I not want to use that money for what I prioritize? I'm individualizing the risk, I might as well individualize what I use that for. And why would that not seem analogous in some way to a LISA, to an ISA, to any form of savings that I might otherwise have? And if I want to prioritize home ownership, and we know that a lot of people do for very good financial reasons, then that makes sense that people would want to do that. But I think that we've moved very far away from what pensions are, certainly in other countries, what pensions were within the UK, and what pensions could be. And when we look at risk and how that risk is allocated across a population, when we look at the potential for redistribution within a pension scheme even, or within a population, and pensions as being a mechanism for doing that, then extracting funds for whatever you prioritize that for feels quite difficult. And so we're looking at a kind of individualized, an increasingly individualized risk and perspective in terms of pensions. But we also know that those that rely on pensions the most, and that's not just women, that those that rely on pensions the most, that are most likely to rely on pensions the most, are served least well by the current individualized risk DC-based system that we have at the moment. And so I think what I would put out there as a provocation to the panel is that if those who are most vulnerable, both in terms of pensions risk, are also likely to be those who are most vulnerable in terms of housing risk. And we know that those are probably not going to be served particularly well by this. Actually, are we putting too much fragility on the system that we have at the moment when we ask questions about adequacy, when we ask questions about accumulation? I like the idea intuitively of things like pensions pledging, for example, but it feels an awful lot like interest-only mortgages, for example. And we generally, as a population, as a people, as humans, tend to be really bad at evaluating risk, like over the long term, both on an individual basis, both in terms of an exposure perspective as well, both in understanding what a portfolio needs to look like in terms of covering that risk for individuals and for us as a whole. So I would start the debate from that perspective of what is a pension, what is it there for, and what does that mean in terms of using that on different bases in order to be able to protect people in later life.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daniela. Really, really just excellent thoughts and a great challenge that I'm sure we will come back to multiple times through the course of the conversation in terms of kind of fundamentally what the retirement system is for. Angela, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So I'm here kind of presenting very much my own views on this, because a lot of it is kind of anecdotal, my own observations, and absolutely throwing these thoughts out, and quite happy to be challenged, because it's all about getting a discussion about these issues going. And thank you so much for opening with that, and all of the opening comments, because it's actually given me even more food for thought. I did actually say in our prep for this, try and rein me in. But the thing that kind of occurs to me most compellingly, and I'm sure has come through in going through the report, is the complexity of the issues. And it's complexity in terms of design and also in terms of implementation. And at the root of that, is very much that this is a public policy point, and we know that when it comes to looking at public policy on things, there is definitely a tension between, introducing something, the cost and the benefit, and actually balancing that. And of course, when we're looking at pensions and we're looking at the existing structure, we're talking about tax relief, and that's money that's not going to the government. So there's got to be a sort of a compelling reason to introduce it, and a profound understanding of what that means in terms of implementation and impact. And I think what the report definitely draws out is that the issues here are indeed very intricate and need to be considered in a very nuanced way. The particular thing I think that kind of came out to me is that what we're looking at is potentially a very significant impact for possibly quite a small group. And that is really challenging. I mean, the thing that kind of springs to mind is things like, issues over particular medicines that are really, really expensive and that might actually benefit only a small group, but a massive cost to the public purse. So in looking at this, I think we've also kind of got to think about what it would involve to create this sort of structure. And lawyers love using this expression, the devil's in the detail, but the devil is definitely in the detail here. But if you think about the sort of implementation measures that you would need to put in place to bring this about, it's effectively its own little ecosystem. So it's actually making sure that financial services covered, making sure that there's appropriate legislation, that it's drafted properly. I would say that, but obviously that's my area. But then you've also got the whole complement around a complaints handling system, possibly an ombudsman, advice. That's also highlighted in the report, and the importance of it. Drawing from Anna's comments about people saying, well, I just don't know whether this is going to be the right decision for me. And also, we in pensions are very used to people going, I made this decision and it wasn't the right one and I wasn't given the right advice, etc. So that's going to have to be handled really, really carefully. And also, we're looking at the kind of intricate issues that exist in pensions already. There's one particular discussion point, and I have to raise it, which is fiduciary duty. And it's a huge debate in pensions already. But the idea that trustees' duties around executing the trust for its proper purposes, if arguably you're starting to change the proper purpose of the trust, what does that mean for trustees' duties, and what does that mean for their investment duties? It's already a very difficult technical area, and we are potentially making things more complex. So I guess what I'm saying is that it is a delicate balancing act, and it is very much more complicated by the fact that we are looking at its core, possibly only helping a small group of people, but in a very, very significant way. And when it comes to looking at the wider group, making sure that whatever eco-structure, whatever system that is put in place is very, very carefully designed, but also bearing in mind that that in itself could be a huge exercise. And I think what's already been kind of nodded to is that we are putting this in a context of pensions, which already doesn't have a brilliant reputation. People are generally quite sceptical of it, don't really understand it. Communication is absolutely key. Pensions UK has brought in some heavyweights in the Pensions for Attention campaign. We had Ross Kemp and Brother Solar last year. But the idea is to draw attention to it. And that's why any kind of dismantling or variation or increased complexity that's introduced into a system that's already greeted with a bit of caution has kind of got to be right, because we're not actually incorporating that into a system that's necessarily very sound in terms of people's perception and use. But having said that, there is a kind of different angle on this that I want to bring to the table. This is probably what brought me into the conversation to begin with, because property and introducing it as part of pensions might actually jazz it up. Because I know from personal experience that there's some communities where property is pretty much top of the chain in terms of the asset that you want to have. Possibly next to gold. I think gold is pretty much top of the tree, but if you own your property, it's the thing to have. And I've often thought about the retirement piece actually as being something that we should think about in terms of what resources do you have. It may not necessarily consist of a pension, but what resources do you have available to you to fund your retirement? And I think if we're looking at it from that sort of wider level, it helps us to give a more sort of holistic viewpoint of the whole situation. And if if housing is a thing and you're introducing that into pensions, you might actually engender more engagement with pensions. And it also makes it a very much more topical and relevant issue for people much earlier in their life and might actually get them thinking about the issues much earlier as well. So I think there's a definite advantage in that too. And so I think all of this is a massively valuable discussion, because I do, from a very kind of just personal observation perspective, see the whole unpicking of this underlying premise that housing costs just really don't feature when it comes to retirement planning. I mean, that's just becoming increasingly compromised. And I think, just lastly, in terms of a personal observation, I do wonder whether kind of COVID has had a little bit of an impact on that, because, you know, if you had, for example, a whole number of people that came home during COVID, and then actually had a collapse of their careers, their jobs, whatever, and then actually found themselves in a very different financial situation where they're actually having to stay at home and not able to go and buy a property. We've got a very changing kind of social structure that's underpinning this whole conversation as well. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela. Again, some really fascinating reflections and insights, which I'm sure we'll get into in the debate. But for now, I will hand straight over to Nathan.
Thanks very much, Will. Morning, all. It's quite hard when you listen to other people say sensible, clever things that you then want to immediately respond to, and you sort of feel like, well, should I just ditch all of my notes? Because there's some really interesting bits in there. So I think first, maybe just to explain some of what we've done at Coastline, which I hope adds some relevance to it. So we're an employer of 400 people. That doesn't sound like a lot. But in Cornwall, that makes us a significant employer. And one of the big things we've done that I think is relevant in terms of my experience is we adopted the Living Pension Standard, which is a very much the same as the kind of the PLSA retirement living standards piece. And having spent my time talking to a lot of my colleagues around what pensions look like, I'm really taken by some of those things where we talk about how complex it is. It's actually, I don't think it is. I think people fundamentally understand they're going to die, they'd like to stop work, and they need to fund the gap between the two. And I think there's a real danger in some things that we can make things sound really complicated when actually lifetime savings, which I think Daniela and I think you've both referenced the idea that the more you think about them as lifetime savings, that then this research really helps speak into the space of what might that look like, given that if your lifetime savings are a whole pot, what does that mean? And so I thought I'd just start by, because inevitably I'm going to be shamelessly pro this idea and just point to all the points in the research that says this is an absolutely brilliant idea. But notwithstanding, and it was a point I think Daniela made when we were having our pre-conversation was, but policy design is really, really important. And I think that definitely sits with me around not just being shamelessly, yes, we should just crack on and do it, but bearing in mind that design is a really important part of what we do. I'm lucky enough that at Coastline we're always looking at innovative ways to try and do things. It's one of the reasons why we've been one of the fastest growing housing associations in the country. That living pensions piece, again, really saw through that actually some of those features around the gender inequality, that they are massive and they are a real issue. But again, simple solutions can present themselves. So rather than just increasing pension contributions, we moved to a flat cash guarantee, non-contributory cash guarantee for all staff. That was driven from my desire largely to look at, we have a lot of people employed in our extra care scheme, predominantly women, who don't pay into their pension because we pay them less, even though we have living wage employers. And it occurred to me the idea that if you don't provide for your pension, I may well have a load of 60-year-old women caring for 55-year-old women, and that seemed perverse. So you need to provide ability for people to be able to retire. And I think that maybe that sits as a separate piece to all the research that Nesta done, because I think pensions adequacy is an issue in its own right that definitely needs to be addressed. And if I kind of park that over to the side and say, I think there are lots of things we can do about that, and focus primarily just on the kind of the research you've got in front of you. I've got mine massively marked up if you want to see all of my thinking about it. But I really do urge, if you haven't read it, it's not as painful as it seems. There's a lot of graphs and some very big tables in there. It's not 80 pages long. Two-sided, printed double-sided on your PDF also makes it a lot more manageable. Although it's a challenge for your 50-year-old eyes, in my case. All the work they've done on the modelling, chapter 1 covers off all of that, and you can see all the background and the hard work that's gone into doing that. And I think that financial modelling about what retirement options are, that is something that employees intrinsically get. People do think about what the future means, and helping unpack that's really, really important. And so I really like that the research spoke to that. And remembering that the research also highlights that the cheapest ways to live in retirement, again, the same piece that the PLSA did and Pensions UK did, my apologies. But that work in there, I think, really highlights the fact that you either need to live in social housing. Okay, well, I'd love to provide social housing for everybody, but there's inevitably a cost to that for the taxpayer, and that is problematic. The other cheapest way, we've said, is home ownership, and I think that's why this research speaks to why that's a good idea. They didn't mention the other option is to live with your parents, but, you know, at some point in retirement, you know, there are inevitable consequences to that. So what are the upsides? That I thought one of the other things in the paper, when you really look at that the number of people who are over 45 privately renting, you know, that's quite a scary statistic when you think as you get older, your ability to make your pension savings leverage up over time is disappearing, isn't it? It's like compound interest is everyone's friend when you're young. The annoying thing is that when you're young, compound interest sounds like a GCSE question and not something that will help you. So I think that the increasing number of private renters, I think that really speaks to a problem, and any form of flexibility over lifetime savings, I think, is really, really important. And how we deliver that, there are lots of options for how we might deliver that too. I also want to ditch all of my notes because all of Daniela's stuff was really interesting. I think that point around complexity I just wanted to address because I think, look at the work, so I know Scottish Widows are in the room, so the work Scottish Widows did about, you know, scan your face, how old are you? I was disappointed that it said I was older than I am, thanks. I'll pick that up with Robert, who invented that. But tech has got such a massive part to play in how young people interact with pensions. If you weren't sure about that, look at the number of people who take up all of the cryptocurrency and the different trading platforms that are available. There's a massive uptake in that. People get investing. They get what saving for the future might look like. And housing is such a big part of that I think that it's really easy to stop and think everything's complex when it's not. We have more access to data. We have more access to gamifying investment. Everyone knows what house prices are doing. I think we do people a disservice. And I thought this research helped point to the fact that there's a piece around financial literacy that clearly has to play in. And that is something that I definitely found through the work I've done with our colleagues around what pensions look like, that the more you start talking about it, as soon as you talk about it, suddenly everything becomes much simpler than it was. The other thing is, remember, it's not a new idea. I think a number of people have mentioned Lifetime Save, the LISA product. So this already exists. So for people who know about LISAs, again, a small minority of people who are generally well off, yes, my two children both have one because I put money into it because it would be a useful way for them to have a deposit for a house and it's tax efficient. But I know from the communities I serve with, generally people who are either not in those networks or not aware of those products or just don't have the money, LISA is not an option for them because it's not mainstream. The idea of mainstreaming LISAs, which is essentially what this is, and like all good ideas, it's not new, and no good ideas are new. Yes, that's always remembering that's. That with that in mind, that if LISAs are something that can work, then so should this. And some of those wraparounds for that, the research gives us some real insights as to what we might need to do around some of those policy points. I just got too carried away with listening to the others. That's the danger with that, isn't it? One of the things I see definitely regionally, and to really bring in that housing point, the access to deposits are the main barrier to home ownership. We do see that. Shared ownership might help that to some degree, but having some ability, that's just page 54 I scribbled down. So again, pointers if you want to have a look. The point about deposits is on page 54. And we see that. And I think being able to have an equity stake in where you live, whatever that looks like, and whatever equity might mean to you, that's really, really important. And I think the ability to transfer your main savings tool into your home, I think is really, really important. I'm going to skip through because I think Will's giving me the eyes like you have to hurry up. And I knew I talked for too long, my apologies. The last couple of bits then, I'll make 2 points, how's that, I promise. One was around that point about looking at what our presumptions are. So the section, the chapter that really talks about, page 59, name check it, sure I've read it. Talks about how different people feel about different things. And I immediately went with, it's older people who currently live in homes are more than happy to say no to this idea because it would give young people something that they want. And the whole intra-group kind of hostility point's really, really interesting. Feel free to check your old psychology books. I think, but if we try and step away from that, just try and think, what is it about it you don't like? And just pause for a minute to think about what your prejudice is for what you don't like. If you're the annuity fund advisor, the reason you don't like it is because you get paid to put annuities in place that nobody understands. That's why you get paid so much for it. But young people aren't interested in annuities because it's complicated maths. So just be mindful of that. I know my desire to see it in place is because I see that the security of a home, which was your last point, security for where you live is a massively important thing. And I don't think any of us would disagree with the last point in the research that you pulled out. And I think this will help. And I said to 2, so last one, I promise. I have to decide which one I want to make. I think the other thing that's in there is, I think registered providers of social housing have got a massive role to play in how this is delivered. Highly regulated environment already, closely connected to communities, detailed understanding of what people want from their housing. And I think that would be the sort of protective wrapper that I would love to see us do something in, as well as thinking about what it means at the other end. Because buying your house is great, but if we are going to think about it as lifetime savings, how do you get out of it at the other end? Because nobody wants to be sitting here pushing equity release, because that sounds scary, but there are plenty of already existing leasehold properties for the elderly, shared ownership for the over 55s. There are a raft of things that will help you kind of de-leverage your investment in housing at the other end as well, and I think keeping some of those in mind would be really important, and sorry, Will.
No, that's great. No need to apologise at all. And again, some really, really great observations. And I love the headline of the public attitudes and which group thinks what in relation to their current circumstance, which I'm sure we might get into again in the conversation. But before we do, our final speaker is Zoe. So Zoe, go ahead.
Thank you, Will, and thanks for having me. Great to be here. I'll start by saying well done, Anna, and well done, Jeanette and team. It's a really great piece of work, and I thought the presentation was super clear and really, really interesting. Some brilliant points from the other panellists, which I'll just briefly mention since I've got the privilege of going last. So I thought Daniela's point about the way that it locks in the individualisation of risk, I think is really fascinating and something I hadn't thought of, so thank you for that. I thought the challenge to the purpose of the trust that you talked about, Angela, was really interesting too and needs a lot of thinking through. And then finally, Nathan, I think we probably are sort of set up to disagree a bit, but I would but I thought, you talked about pensions not being that hard for people. That's kind of the beauty of them, but we kind of want them to leave them alone if Pensions UK if they can. So yeah, we're going to be in a slightly different place. So I've got a written speaking note, so I'm sorry if this is a little bit wooden because I'm going to read out, but hopefully I'll be a little bit less wooden in the discussion. So obviously this research is about considering how a growing personal asset could be rationally better deployed to improve lifelong financial well-being. And what this research shows is that enabling access to DC pots for housing could improve outcomes for a relatively small group of people sharing similar characteristics. And that's a really interesting and useful finding in itself. But what's more striking to me is the risks it raises, particularly around use by people who might have eventually made it onto the housing ladder in any event. Policies, we all know, can be a very blunt instrument, so containing early access to a sweet spot demographic would likely be very difficult and potentially politically unattractive. I was also interested in the extent to which many members of the public felt nervous or even angry, as you said, Anna, about their savings being used in this way. And that becoming the expectation or the norm. And that's very consistent with, as you won't be surprised to hear, some of the findings that we've found over the years in research. Some recent research we conducted that's reinforced for us the value that people place on their retirement saving, and also the sense they hold that those savings are in themselves already insufficient and what that means for them. We all know very well that we're facing into a pensions adequacy problem in the UK, so I'm not going to labour that point, and we need to be very careful about any policy that risks disrupting the saving that is happening. One risk I think it's worth highlighting here, though, that we haven't talked about much is the thin end of the wedge policy risk. The automatic enrolment system is relatively new. The first contributions were only taken in 2012. Assets under management of the larger schemes are now growing at an incredible rate, and individual balances are growing too. And as that happens, particularly in the difficult economic climate that we find ourselves in, attention naturally turns to whether those assets could somehow be deployed in other ways. We're all familiar with the debate about pensions and growth and the extent to which schemes should be investing in UK productive assets. So what worries me, at least in part here, is that as politics becomes more polarised and politicians seek quick popular wins, and the Trump example, thanks for giving me the heads up on that, Will, over coffee, early access to pensions is exactly the kind of measure they might seize upon in a similar vein. As an example of how this might play out, besides in the US, the Conservative MP Peter Bedford recently tabled an amendment to the current bill to enable people to access their pension to buy a first home, or to cover a period of unemployment, or to pay for the cost of getting married. So we need to proceed with caution, and I'm really pleased that the report makes that very clear. There's no doubt we're facing into a housing crisis in this country, and that the number of people entering into retirement renting is rising fast. So it's contingent on all of us to think about what that means for the pension system, and these remarks aren't intended to minimise that problem. Indeed, it's worth remembering that illiquid patient capital is ideal for long-term investment into affordable housing schemes, something pension schemes are increasingly bringing into their portfolios. Perhaps for me, this is where pensions could play a role in helping to address the housing crisis, as opposed through liquidity at the individual level, which could, in the end, represent a challenge to the concept of locked-in long-term saving.
Brilliant, thanks. So, in a great way to close the first part of the panel. So, I think in a minute, Anna is going to come up and join us. So I'll just ask a couple of questions first, and I'm just going to start with a comment, which is whether reflective of the broader sectors from which you come or not. It's interesting, isn't it, that I think kind of the tone of this conversation would suggest that those who start from a pensions policy set of questions perhaps are rather more concerned about the risks of this, and those who start from a housing security set of questions are perhaps more in favour, at least in the panel that we have. That's maybe something we'll unpick a little bit in the course of the conversation. And it sort of puts me in mind of something that I heard someone say in a completely different context at a conference last week, which really stayed with me, which was, we think about public policy in verticals, but people live their lives horizontally. And so how we manage this reality that people face all sorts of financial security issues at a household level, and yet we're sort of trying to think through these policy challenges in reasonably vertical ways. I think it sort of comes through very strongly, I think, in this whole topic and in some of the reactions that we've had. So I will start with, do we want to do the move around first? Okay, so we're just going to bring Anna up, not least in case any of the questions that come from the audience are technical, and I will be unable to answer them. Welcome, Anna. You and I can share a microphone. Before I open up to the audience, though, I will start, I guess, just by asking, we asked the audience at the start, so instinctively, how do they feel about this idea? I suspect we may try and ask them again at the end. Was there anything in your engagement specifically with this research that changed your view, or that kind of added to your kind of going in priors about a topic like this? Is there anything that you feel might have shifted your own view, or that you think particularly needs kind of further exploration? And I'll start, Daniela, with you.
I don't think it's shifting of view, but I think that we've presented this really as a sort of dichotomy of sort of renting, within the market as it currently stands, or home ownership. And that, again, I think makes intuitive sense. But I think what we're not necessarily looking at is opportunities for improvement of the rental sector. And so when we talk about private renting, who would want to rent in today's market? Yes, I recognise that home ownership is infinitely better than that. But I think that we shouldn't give up, and that we should look at ways that we can make secure, affordable renting a reality for people, so that there are 3 options, so that you can rent short-term, that you can rent long-term, or you can own. And I think that is a much better choice than having to choose between only ownership or only renting within a market, which just doesn't work at the moment.
Great, thanks, Danielle. I'll go straight down the line with this question, and then I'll maybe mix the order up a little bit with my next one. So, Angela, any reflections?
Yeah, sure. And I think kind of feeding into that is this kind of idea of security, because it was more about feeling secure. And I think that picking up on Daniela's point, that if you can improve the rental market, and we've seen, there's some coming in May this year that are attempts to improve the rights of renters. But I think fundamentally it's also just about that feeling of, I'm secure in my retirement. And I think that becomes kind of probably more acute as you get older, when you perhaps feel a bit more vulnerable and you want to feel that that's one less thing that you have to worry about. And so I think that's really key. And I felt that sentiment really did come out in the report in terms of people's views. And I think also just coming back to my initial points about it's not so much... I'm a big believer in not being defeated by complexity, because I think if something's worth doing, there's always going to be... I've used this in a different context on some different NEST research, but where there's a will, there's a way. But I think absolutely recognising the challenges around it are key. And again, coming back to the point that Nathan made earlier, which is the benefit, that the design is going to be absolutely key as well, because the sweet spot here is quite difficult to identify, with obvious kind of winners, losers, costs, benefits, etc. So those are the key things that kind of occurred to me.
Great, thanks. Angela and Nathan?
Yeah, I think for me it was the piece around the homeowners and the over 45s and the level of the private renting. And I think, as we've talked about, but just to be clear, I'm not going to disagree with Daniela, and there should be a lot more in terms of choices for renting. But I've worked in housing for 25 years, and trying to address how we deal with property in the UK feels like a really tough ask. I think I'd much rather fix pensions, which maybe speaks to either a lack of knowledge of pensions on my part, or just the 25 years of being battered trying to get more housing delivered. I think on balance, the thing that surprised me about the report is still how I was surprised that there still seems to that it feels like there's more reluctance to it, and the idea that people saw risk in it. And I think that still surprises me around the idea around the complexity piece, which I just don't feel is borne out from, and I accept that's only me speaking to however many colleagues over the course of, certainly when we did the living pensions pilot, that was, I think I must have spoken to all 400 colleagues at different team meetings and different points, and I don't think I got any sense of people feeling it was complicated. That I genuinely get a sense of people feeling that they understand what savings are for, they understand what pensions are for, but I would accept that I think this research piece around really highlighting that, are we asking you to make choices that in an ideal world we wouldn't want you to make? And I definitely understand that, and I think there's a lot of cautionary tale in that. But then that comes, for me, that speaks to maybe there's more work to be done in terms of policy implementation, rather than there being anything particularly that surprised me in the report per se.
Great, thanks. Nathan and Zoe?
So I was really interested in the pie chart with the 55,000, which were the kind of sweet spot demographic that you felt this would work for. And the fact that it was, I think you said 50% of those were over 45. And I'm really interested to understand, probably as a separate piece of research in future, what the intergenerational wealth transfer from those who still have parents who are alive looks like for that group, and how many people receive that wealth, how many people it skips a generation, it goes to grandchildren who might still be in their 20s, and for how many people just is there nothing there. I think that's really fascinating, because that will affect the size of that group. I was also interested and slightly suspicious of the fact that you said, I believe you, but you said that I'm not. I was suspicious of the higher income people who like the idea, is what I was going to say, because of course, you can see this as just another mechanism they could use. People that are already engaged and they don't have to ask their parents their deposit. They could get it, but then very safely make up the pension saving later. So I think that spoke to this idea that you could do something relatively blunt, but it might catch a load of people that it shouldn't effectively catch. I think the other thing I'd say is, when I've talked about this whole idea to colleagues at Pensions UK, I've always said, well, look, if you did this, now is not the time, because pot sizes are too small, and I think that it reinforces that sense for me as well. Obviously, contributions need to go up. We're constantly saying that. If contributions go up and we give it a few more years, I still would have real concerns about it for all the reasons that I've described, but I think the pledging ideas feel safer to me in the way that they did to members of the public you were talking to. But I think now is not the time, and I think I would worry about moving too fast and just re-emphasise the size of pots, which I think in Nest is still $7,500 or something. They're really tiny in some cases. Yeah.
Thanks. So I'm going to come, Anna, to you in just a second. First, I'm going to just flag to people that shortly I'll be coming out to the audience. As I said before, by all means, just stick your hand up and we'll bring a microphone to you. But if you prefer for any reason to do so, the QR code for the Slido link is up on the screen, and hopefully I will be able to see your questions as they come through, and we have a backup plan if I can't see them for any reason. So please also feel free to use that mechanism. I guess, Anna, if you can remember back to the days before you were working on this project and then think yourself through it, I'm sort of fascinated because you'd already done a lot of work on housing and pensions previously at the PPI. What's the thing that surprised you the most? What kind of, through the course of this work, if anything, caused you to sort of stop and go, oh, hang on a minute, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that sense. Can't remember.
It feels like such a long time ago. It really does. I think overall, in much bigger picture, what surprised me is how far we've come in understanding this, and how much I personally leaned on my intuition before now. I mean, I remember several conversations over the last couple of years. People said, what do you think of this idea? Leaned so heavily on it, and realizing now actually how much more there is. And how much complexity, I think I agree with. So taking that word out of the conversation for now, how much more depth there is to this. And that aligns with something that I think I found relatively surprising, which is, as Zoe touched on, people's attitudes towards the idea somewhat aligned with some of their kind of household characteristics, but not totally. We found some older homeowners, for example, who were very supportive of the idea. And likewise, we found some younger people who were very concerned about the idea. So I think that that talks to a lot sort of deeper concerns that people have and reflections that people have that shape their thoughts on whether they might want to do this. I think for the higher income group, I think the interesting thing probably is how much they're spending on rent at the moment. I thought exactly the same when it comes through. I thought, why is this? So I think that sort of broad alignment of attitudes and characteristics, is great. But what surprised me is that actually there was a lot of exceptions to that. I think there's also one other point that I just wanted to make as well, which the size of we'll call them the red group versus the blue group, really surprised me, right? So what you see in that large group of people who under our modelling could already afford potentially a deposit really tells you, the question there is, why are they not already buying a home? Well, it's because in many cases, actually, we looked at, for example, a 10% deposit, even a 5% deposit. The implications of that for the cost that people might have to spend on their mortgage is quite significant. And on average, and Robin will know better than me, I think first-time buyers spend around, is it about 20%? Normally is about the average, about 20% deposit roughly for first-time buyer properties. One of the reasons for that is in order to access better mortgage rates. So I think it's really important too to remember that within that group, even though we make this really big distinction between renting and owning, there is also a big distinction between renting and owning in working life, right? Which is that actually you can get some really significant benefits from boosting the deposit. So that was definitely, I think, the scale of the difference. And that was throughout all the scenarios we looked at, whether it was how much of your pension savings you could use, what loan-to-income threshold should you use, what loan-to-value deposit should you use, all of those. The number of people who might choose to do it was so much larger. And with that comes the risk of the unintended consequences.
Great, thanks, Anna. So I think I'm just going to go out now to the audience, mainly because I want to make sure that we have time to get to any questions or discussions. There's other things I'd love to come back to if we have time, but let's see how we get on. So while you in the audience are thinking about your question, well, in fact, we'll go straight to Jeanette, who has a hand up at the front here.
So it was mentioned, I think perhaps a little bit in passing, but this is something for DC, right? And there are lots of people who this won't even benefit. And who are these people? They're the public sector workers, the nurses, the doctors, the firefighters, the police, all of that sort of stuff. And when we talk to people in the discussion forums about who couldn't even touch this because they got the wrong sort of pension, they were absolutely shocked. And I just wondered, will this lead to unintended consequences for DB pensions? I'd open that up to the panel.
Anyone? Angela?
We'll have views, I'm sure. No, go on. So somebody else should definitely go first.
No, just to say, my instinctive reaction was around the protections that were built in around pension freedoms. when the pension flexibilities were announced and of course introduced in relation to DC, there were the advice requirements that were introduced for transfers from DB schemes over 30k. So basically, those transfers couldn't happen unless the trustees were satisfied that individuals had taken advice. I absolutely see your point. But I think the balancing act becomes more difficult, doesn't it? Because here it's flexibility and then some. And it's also addressing a very kind of pressing need, and also the potential for people to go, I want to transfer from my very valuable DB pension scheme, but how do we value it? Do you see what I mean? Like, because actually, is it more valuable for me to have it available to fund housing? So I suspect there would be a discussion around that, but is that valid? Sorry.
And there's, well, sorry, no, go on, Nathan, you go ahead.
I was going to say, why exclude them? I mean, we know that at 55 or 57, you get a statement that says, do you want your pension of X or do you want a bit of cash, and your pension goes down? It's not beyond the wit of very smart actuaries to say, well, however old you are, if you're taking some money, I think that's the point you just made, that it's like, that's an entirely possible thing. So that doesn't feel beyond the wit of man. And again, it comes back to, it's as complicated or as simple as you want to make it. So I'd include all the DB pensions in
I
it,
would say
or
it's
ditch them
beyond
all.
the wit of man, but I mean, it really is. No, I didn't mean man. I meant in general. But I would share Angela's comment. I mean, I think my worry would be that people saving in very valuable DB pensions wouldn't understand that they're already in a fantastic position, that it would create a sense of injustice among that group, and the DB to DC transfer issue, which is, it would just increase that imperative, which generally is not a good thing, is it? So, yeah.
It's also a significantly different challenge in unfunded public sector DB plans than it is in funded private sector ones. Much harder to wrap one's head around how that might work, I guess. Yes, go ahead.
Super quickly, there is a number in the report, actually. We looked at how many people might have enough pension saving to meet our threshold. So in the baseline scenario, 300,000 people had enough pension savings for it to be able to use this deposit, but couldn't use it because the majority of it was in DB. So it's a significant number.
So I'm going to go to a question that's been shared on Slido, and then I'll come back out to the audience. And I'm paraphrasing slightly here, but there's a question here which is fascinating. Right? So pensions are built on the assumption that people either own their homes or are in social rent in retirement, and as we discussed, that's becoming a less sustainable assumption. And so the question is kind of, if to some degree the pensions sort of industry is going to have to reckon with that challenge in some way. So if not this, how else? How else should the industry think about the fact that it's trying to supply incomes in retirement to people who may have a significantly different cost base to the ones that we designed the system for?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I don't know who is it.
It's
anonymous.
It's anonymous.
I mean, I would dispute the idea that pensions were built on the assumption. I think the adequacy replacement rates assumed home ownership or no cost of housing in retirement, and that's something we need to think about. And we have the RLS, Retirement Living Standards at Pensions UK, which are, by the way, more of a yardstick. They're not intended as an adequacy measure. They're intended for people to look at and imagine what their income needs might be. I think, it's something we have to grapple with and think about, but that doesn't make it a pensions problem. It's a little bit like the social care question, which comes around every now and again. How on earth do we fund social care? Well, of course, we should use automatic enrolment. How do we fund disposable emergency savings? Perhaps we should have a sidecar. And by the way, I think that's a really, really interesting, credible idea. So I'm not trying to lump all these things together. But pensions cannot solve every problem that we have. And I go back to some of the comments that people have made about trying to improve access to affordable housing and to reform the renting sector. And I think that's where our focus should be. If you look at the rates of saving required, and it was referenced by Anna in her presentation, how much renting costs in retirement, you would have to put contributions up to a, frankly unaffordable level to cover that. And so I think, I would dispute that pensions were built to do this. Pensions were built to enable people to have some private savings when they weren't, automatic enrolment particularly was built when they weren't saving, to get them saving again. And we just need to push contributions up higher, but not high enough, I would say, to cover rent.
Great, thanks. So I don't know anything to add.
I wasn't going to jump in there because I agreed with a lot with what Zoe was saying, but I think overall, what I'm hearing is that pensions work best for the people that need them least. And if we talk about the people, you know, not just pensions, but think of everything that's involved when you're older. We're not just thinking about housing costs, and, you know, I wasn't going to get into the technicalities of adequacy and, you know, target replacement rates and, you know, Pensions UK, but we can go there. You know, housing's not included within that. We know that that's a gap. But we also recognise the fact that health is a factor, and actually the poorer you are, the less likely you are to be in good health as you age as well. So we're looking at not just longevity risk, but we're looking at health risk, we're looking at housing risk, and we're looking at an adequacy gap that we are seeing in real time. And we also, you know, obviously I have to put that in there, that is most likely to be women who have no options as they age. So as we look forward, I really am thinking, well, what do we do? What is the value, really, of a tiny, inadequate pensions pot when you have all of these costs in older age? And no, pensions probably are not the solution to that, but we need to think, how are we thinking systemically across social care, across housing, across health, to ensure that people can age with dignity and that their needs can be met? Because the funding is going to come from somewhere. Either it comes from, you know, a system that at the moment is distributing really inefficiently and ineffectively, or it's coming from government who are going to have to fund that. And that's the lived reality of what we are facing. So I think as we look forward and we think about risk, I think thinking about that entirely on an individualized basis is, well, it's fine, we can do that, but we need to recognize who is not going to be met, whose needs are not going to be met by planning forward in that way.
I am fast realising that we should have allowed 2 hours for the Q&A portion of this, which shouldn't come as a surprise, as I reflected at the start that we already knew there were some strong views even before we published the research. I'm going to come to Emma Douglas next in the back there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Will. Emma Douglas from Aviva. Yeah, great to see this research. I was involved with Anna in the PPI research that sort of started asking these questions, so fabulous to see much more depth to it this time round. One of the things that I was thinking about when listening to the panel and the presentation was, how do we get to that blue segment? You know, how do we actually direct, you know, any policy towards that segment? Can we identify them? And one of the things that is coming this year is targeted support. So as a pension provider, we will be able to categorise people into segments, people like you, and then actually offer, you know, some, you know, directions, some suggestions as to what people should do. And so what you got me thinking about was, is it possible for us to ask a few questions, because we won't be able to ask lots of questions as part of this targeted support, and then work out, is someone in the blue segment or the red segment? You know, will we be able to actually help them using this new mechanism? Can we identify these people? Or is it actually going to be too hard? Are we going to need too much information? And then that made me think, well, how on earth do we ask an individual to do that then if we as so-called experts can't do it? So I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that one. Thank you.
Great. Does anyone have an immediate reaction to that?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think first thing I thought was, are they logging on to the Aviva website to access targeted support, that group? I mean, question. I suspect it would be very difficult, and I suspect if you could do it, it might be open to gaming, because people would want to answer the questions in the right way to get into the blue segment in order to get their money out. And how do you design policy around such a complex set of circumstances? I think it's very difficult. I think it's a good thought, but I'm interested in others' reactions to it.
I mean, I think it, you know, from my perspective, Emma, you've picked up on a theme that I think just comes through very strongly underpinning the whole research, which is big benefit for small group of people, much more complicated picture for everyone else, either through the policy design or through targeted support or through both, is it possible to ring fence something like this to where the benefit is biggest and clearest, without risking it kind of spreading out in ways that are unhelpful? And I don't know the answer, but I think it's certainly the question that comes through. I'm going to take 2 quick fire questions from Slido. So these we'll do sort of quickish answers to these, but these are the ones that are being upvoted. So the first is, how does the panel feel about people aged 57 using their tax-free lump sum to give their children a deposit for a house, which is the sort of informal version of this that already exists to some degree? And the second question, and I'll ask anyone invite anyone who has a view on either to respond, is what people think about the potential behavioural changes this could drive, which Angela, you started to touch on. People could save more into their pension because they know this is available to them. Equally, I think Anna, you said in the findings, some people suggested they might end up sort of becoming complacent about saving for a house if they knew they could do this. So there are sort of behavioural potential interactions both ways. So people taking lump sums to give to their kids for home ownership and or behavioural reactions to policy. I'll start, Daniela, with you.
I was going to say, well, people are already doing that. So that is where we find ourselves at the moment. So people are, using their, tax-free sum. And I think there are a number of unintended consequences around that, policy decision that haven't really been fully examined. So whether or not I have a kind of view on whether people should do that, I'm also aware that those that are kind of, sort of that form of intergenerational wealth transfer, I know Zoe sort of mentioned that, that's a whole other topic. All I would say is it's really, really badly distributed. So again, those that need it the most are the ones that are least likely to be able to access any form of inheritance overall. But I would also sort of say that there are other people who are using, particularly women, who are using those sums to fund the gap between, their paid work and their unpaid work until they can reach state pension age. So again, we find that those who have options can leverage those options in different ways, and some people are using that to pay for their everyday costs until such time as they can afford to retire, if they can at all.
Great, thanks, Daniela. Zoe?
Yeah, I think I worry about the normalisation of everyone just taking out 25% because that's what the government says they can get, and I obviously there's cases where it's the right thing to do, but if you've got a relatively small income above the state pension, it's a big whacking part of that income. It occurred to me as well, there's gendered effects to these sorts of things, of women feeling more on the hook for passing money down to children. So I think about that and what it does to women's pensions in particular. I think on the behavioural reactions to the policy, I think kind of normalisation of pensions as a kind of flexible lifetime savings vehicle is the thing that worries me, and also potentially, to the research point, the normalisation of an expectation that you get to a certain point in your savings and then you have to take 25% out to get your house is a concern.
Yeah, it's interesting that's your biggest concern, but for me that feels like the biggest benefit, because in terms of selling pensions to young people or calling them lifetime savings, there's so much more traction, I think, when you talk about what this looks like for your home ownership journey. And for me that feels like that could be a bit like this policy might only affect a limited number of people at the beginning, but it has the ability to be transformational in terms of making younger people think about the future. I mean, 20 was a long time ago, but I do still vaguely feel immortal occasionally. But I think there's something about being able to package up your lifetime savings and the things that you want in your life and making you understand what that looks like. I mean, kids spend for hours playing games where you click things 105 times to get the next best thing. All we need to do is, and this helps pensions be the same thing, which is if you want these things, you have to click in on your contribution every time. And I think we missed the benefit. Auto-enrollment's been phenomenally successful, but I think picking up, I also feel those concerns around. We see that it's the lower paid colleagues who are always opting out because of affordability issues. And I definitely want to, whatever we design, address some of that. But I don't think we get around the pensions inadequacy problem by leaving people in the most expensive form of housing in the future. And I think that's the reason why I'm still voting yes, encouraging people to say it's a good thing. And looking at that problem and saying, the more you could encourage people to put more in, that's only going to help. If you can help them see things that they want, trying to sell to a 25-year-old you can have an annuity when you're in your 60s is dull. I don't want to try and sell that to anybody. telling you that you can get a house, that you can move on, that you can imagine what your life looks like, that you'll be well looked after in your old age, that there are options for you. Those all feel like things that would make people interested in pensions. And I know that because I've tried pitching that idea to 400 people, and I had 50 people ask me, can I put my money into a LISA instead of into my pension scheme?
Okay, thanks, David. Angela, any?
Just really quickly, that so I agree. I think people are using their tax-free lump sum to help young people get on the housing ladder. My slight concern about that, I guess, is that that might be masking the issue, because the net result is that people are, younger people are buying their homes. It's just that their parents are having to use the tax-free lump sum, and it might mean, again, to address your point, Daniela, that the fundamental systemic issues are not being addressed, and so I think that needs to be unpicked.
And Anna, you had a comment.
Super quick, relevant point that came out. There's a section in the research called Insight Into, and one of them is, what do people do in order to save for a deposit? We found that on average 6% of people stop saving into a pension or reduce their contributions in order to save for a deposit for a home, and that rises to 10% among some groups. So age 35 to 44, where home ownership is more urgent, goes up to 10%, and also in some groups from ethnic minority backgrounds as well, where there's clearly that preference for home ownership. So to some extent, people are already making those decisions, but not necessarily in the way that's in their best interests.
And I would just add, I mean, as an interesting, as yet only anecdotal finding, but we were chatting to someone in the States last week who was talking about some of the early implications of the new provision for accessing $1,000 penalty-free for emergencies out of your 401k. He was saying that at least at the employer level, there's some anecdotal evidence both that more people are joining the pension and that they are quite quickly upping their contributions to then in response sort of top themselves back up. And so there is at least some evidence that this kind of thing can encourage more engagement among some groups and more take up among some groups, but it's also clearly going to pull some money out of the system from some groups, and so the balance between those things is really tricky. So I think there's some other hands that have been going up in the audience. There's many. I think the chap here on my left by the aisle has caught my eye a number of times.
I've been trying really hard, despite the fact that this is Andrew's story. I might have to admit that I'm an actuary at this point. But what I wanted to talk about was the big T that's only been mentioned. I think I've counted it 4 times because I'm an actuary. The tax. The reason why pensions are pensions is because you get tax relief. So you actually have full flexibility on what you can do with all your money and when you spend it. Right now, the difference is that with your pension you get the tax relief, and that's the bit. So the point that has been made quite well, that the people who want the tax relief are the people who got the most amount of money, because you go, ooh, I can get some more tax relief from this. And the changes that you make tend to be about the tax. The reverse of that is the reason you get the tax relief is because the government expects you to do something later, because otherwise they just take the tax now. And we've seen actually in South Africa the reverse has happened, where they actually had a pension where you could use it 100% for an emergency if you needed to. So you got the tax relief and you could use 100% of your pension for exactly what we're talking about, never mind 25%, 100%. And then they realised that meant that lots of people were taking their pension out, so they were giving all this tax relief that wasn't then helping them with the housing and all the income later, and that then is a problem. So then they said, no, actually you can't take all your money out, and then there were riots. And so they actually ended up having to say, well, you can keep 25% of it, so that you can now use that for emergencies, and the other 75% you do have to hang on to it. So they've actually just recently introduced some new legislation which has basically reversed what they previously could do. So it's always interesting to see that whenever we come up with a new policy, there's always a country somewhere else that's literally reversing what it is we're trying to do. The annuity thing happened with flexible pensions, and in Australia were doing the exact reverse of that at the point we were making it flexible. Because a guaranteed income is a good idea, right? So the question really is about, for the tax part of it, is there going to be trust that the tax relief, that you can take it out and you start saving into your pension, and then the government decides that they do actually need you to hang on to the money, and therefore they'll change the rules shortly so you can no longer take it out to buy your house 3 weeks before you're about to exchange?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Just before the last budget, with all the speculation around the tax-free lump sum, you already started to see people saying, well, I'm going to take my money now
By the way, it's a good thing to do because it's now in inheritance tax. If you take your tax-free cash out, it actually is the only time it will be tax-free. But
This, of course, is
that's
not a
advice.
regulated financial advisory environment, just for the avoidance of doubt. Any immediate reflections on that, Nathan?
Mine will inevitably a very simple reflection on that, which is I think it's remembering it's not just the tax relief that's important for low earners, it's the employer's contribution. And that's the main reason why it's much easier for lower paid colleagues who choose, and remember, the Resolution Foundation did a massive piece to show that matching contributions are awful, but don't get me started on that, because there's lots of reasons why you shouldn't. It's one of the reasons why we have a non-contributory element for lower paid staff only at Coastline. And I think you have to remember that the employer's contribution is significant, and what we're talking about here is allowing I think this is about primarily allowing lower paid people to access their employer's contribution in a way that they can't. Because if it's all about just the tax relief, then that's rich people who don't need help. Because if it's primarily about the tax relief element, then you probably don't need the sort of help that we're talking about here. And I think that would pick up some of the other points around some of the gender inequality on this. I think on the amount of tax relief you would get to put it into your house, just limit that. That feels like, again, policy's either simple or complicated, and I'm a massive fan of simple. If you said you can take it out up to X tax-free, but thereafter not, and that's the sort of thing you'd be like, right, cool, it's set in the legislation, and you just review the amount up every year to give us all reassurance that it's not going to disappear. It might get frozen like your tax allowance, but if you knew you could take out 20 grand tax-free, and I think there's the work we did around the living pensions, the cash floor piece for contributions, massive benefit. There was like a good chunk of my workforce who weren't paying in to a pension because they couldn't afford to. We were like, right, we'll just put in for you. You shouldn't have to match my contribution for me to give you the money I would otherwise give you. Let me give you something. And this feels like the same sort of thing, that it's about letting people access their employer's contribution, and it's about limiting the tax-free amount so that we don't overcomplicate it. And again, fixing it in legislation as an amount means that then all the Chancellor has to do is review that one amount every year, and that stops it being at risk of, oh yeah, let's just scrap that, which is inevitably dangerous and drives perversity in the housing market.
One thing that was very interesting in the expert interview phase of this work, or at least I found it very interesting, is that even people who were ostensibly extremely positive about this idea get very queasy about the idea that it might apply to 100% of the pot, tend to anchor around 25%, partly because, at the moment at least, you will go on to be able to take 25% tax-free anyway, or maybe 50%, but almost no one seems comfortable with the idea that this could be 100% of your pot, and partly that's about the perceived legitimacy from the employer perspective of their own requirement to contribute, partly it's about tax relief, and partly it's just an inherent queasiness about not allowing people to take 100% of their pensions money out, but that was just a theme that spread right across. Helen?
Thanks, Helen Forrest Hall from the Pensions Management Institute. A brilliant report, and I should probably declare not only 20 years as a dyed-in-the-wool pensions geek who used to think this was a terrible idea that no one should go anywhere near, but I think building on a couple of points that Andrew made, and I completely get Zoe's point about the fact that it isn't sort of pensions jobs to fix mass generational inter equality. I suppose what is really interesting, and also that now might not be the time, not least because, Trump, but I think at the same time, we have got a pensions commission, and they are going to be looking at broad questions about what does adequacy look like across working age and into and through into retirement. And that does feel like a really, really opportune moment to think about, well, hang on a minute, how do you get comfortable in a world where you might start to introduce increased contributions into pension schemes, technically not mandatory, but not far off because we know what the behavioural impacts are. And yet we know people can't afford to get on the housing ladder. We know that their costs in retirement are going through the roof. And we also know that pensions tax relief is really badly distributed. So actually, if you're going to have a conversation about the costs to government, to employers, and to individuals about the most effective use of their lifetime savings, not least because you wouldn't do it quickly, this does feel like a good time to be having that conversation, because you do need to think about, well, actually, if government is going to be spending money to target those low to median earners, what's the best use of that cash? How do you solve the problem about, well, wouldn't it be nice if those nurses could access their DB tax-free lump sum? But I appreciate that government doesn't like the fact that that's an immediate cost to them now because it's unfunded. But similarly, I imagine somebody somewhere cares that the housing benefit bill is going to go through the roof in 30 years' time. So as much as it isn't for pensions to solve this, there is a commission, and you can't solve some of the answers to some of these questions without the others. So apology, probably more of a statement than a question, but and I think particularly that cost to government point, I think is something I'm quite interested in the panel's views from.
Sorry, looks. I've got some body language out the side of my eye here. So
I think well, I know the Pensions Commission scope is relatively actually constrained. So while we are, I think, all in the pensions industry thinking, isn't this great? We've got 2 years to have this really great, deep and rich debate about how is this money used and what's the future for pensions adequacy and where do we want to head. Actually, they're not formally looking at tax, they're not formally looking at the state pension. Can you realistically have those debates without looking at those things? I think, no, you can't. And so one of the things we're doing at Pensions UK is trying to see if we can fill some of those gaps and think a bit more holistically about the whole picture alongside the Pensions Commission. I think the other thing I bring out, which sounds a bit parochial, but I think is important, is timing. So we're in 2026 now. We're waiting for the first call for evidence of the Pensions Commission report. We don't think that's going to come until late spring. You know, it's reporting in 2027. That's not a great deal of time. And there is a real imperative from my perspective to focus on the big wins of getting contributions up, not necessarily for everybody in a blanket way. And we're looking at what flexibility you might need to introduce to account for lower earners who can't afford those contributions. But to get those that really core adequacy debate landed and won and have some consensus behind it before we get into another parliament. And I'm not sure we do have actually the space for the kind of really rich holistic debate that we all acknowledge needs to happen as part of that Pensions Commission process.
thanks. Daniel?
I was just going to come in at this and say, I think, you know, probably most of the people in this room, right, are people who are deeply involved in pensions and the technicalities around pensions, and we're probably involved in various levels of those debates and discussion. We know that we've got a review of the state pension age that's happening at the moment. We know that we've got the Pensions Commission. You know, you talked about tax. I'm looking and I'm thinking, oh, you know, it's just really badly distributed, and yes, it is gendered, and we need to absolutely look at those things, and we absolutely need to join those things up. But in a way, I kind of, you know, my main kind of challenge around this is this idea that, you know, people need to know more about pensions, and we take that as a starting assumption. And I think, no, I think what people want is to trust that they will have an adequate income to live on as they get older. If they're unable to work, that they can trust that that support system will be there. Not that I need to be thinking about that every day, not that I need to be logging in, again, declare interest. I have an Aviva pension, right? I get your letters. Yes, I do log in. But someone shouldn't have to do that. I think what people want is a system that they can have confidence in. And when we talk about behaviours, then actually we are looking at the longest run level of policy that we could possibly have. I don't really want to be there if I'm 25 worrying about, is that system going to change? Do I have to think about, you know, constantly having to revisit my assumptions as I move through all of the complexities of the life course anyway? So actually, I think building stability in, making sure that we make those connections, that we are thinking about what, you know, non-contributory looks like. We are thinking about, people don't always start poor and end up poor. People can change their circumstances as they move through the life course. Having trust in a system, I think, is the fundamental of a functional pension system. And I think at the moment, not only do the people outside of this room not have trust in the system that it is going to provide them with an adequate income, I think a lot of us in this room don't have trust that the system at the moment is going to provide for enough people. And we're saying that in different ways. And actually, for us, when we're thinking about housing, which is just another, you know, element that we bring into that, I think we do need to start to join the dots. And I think we do need to speak very transparently about what the system needs to do in order for us all to have trust that it is functional and that it is working.
Just only, and I promise to be super brief on that, I absolutely agree with the point on consistency, but I think we miss something if we don't acknowledge, and you referenced the complexity of life. I think people need and want choices. I think the idea that pensions originally designed when we'll all die at 70, and that's why you could retire at 60 because you wouldn't live very long. I think the idea that lots of us will live into our hundreds is something that has to be addressed. The fact that if you know you can get hold of some money at 57, well, of course everyone takes it, goes on a big holiday, buys a nice car. Why wouldn't you do that? And I think the only bit I would reference is I know I've made bad choices. I started in a defined benefit scheme. I was at the employer for a year. I took the cash out because I needed it to fund my very early divorce, making stupid mistakes in a big way. Then I've had a large DB scheme for a decent amount of time. That was great. So 10 years of that, which looks phenomenal against the 10 years I've just put into the DC. So I do get how brilliant DB is, but it's not available for most people. And then the DC offers phenomenal amounts of optionality for people when things go wrong. And I think having some design around what the exits look like that try to balance off some of those risks, I think would be helpful. And I think that's why the research is really helpful at saying, given the problems with long-term housing costs, you need some ability to think about what that looks like in the short term. And I think the idea that, does anyone have any trust in any long-term financial institutions anymore? Well, that's maybe one for a different day. But I just think there's something about enabling people to make choices, because poorer people make choices all the time about things. And I think there's a danger in assuming that they're not able to make or making some assumptions that people can't make those choices when they do. And they make those choices all the time. And I think our best thing here is to be more flexible about what those things look like so that they have more intrinsic value to people who often know exactly what the worst things in life look like, and that's why they won't pay into a pension, because they can't get it out.
Okay, I'm going to offer Angela a final word, and then we're going to need to wrap up, I'm afraid, because of time. So, Angela.
Oh gosh, that's pressure. Well, I mean, I guess I was just going to actually stand back from it all and say that I just remember the discussions around stakeholder, and maybe what this is really about is being honest about pensions and actually giving people proper information and saying, this is really thinking ahead about when you retire, you're going to have a source of income. Where is that going to come from? And again, a lot of my comments came from, well, I recognise certain communities will put their money in property because that's where they see that's going to provide them the income in retirement. Great. Why do we have a problem with that? Because they've weighed up the benefits and the risks, lack of tax relief, complexity, whatever. Sorry, I keep using that word, but it's there. So maybe what it is that we just need to make people aware that that's what they've got to think about. There's a variety of ways, and pensions is just one of them. And give them that kind of financial education and make them think about it as early as possible so they can then go ahead and make their choices based on their circumstances.
Okay, there's clearly a great deal more conversation that we could and would love to have, but I want to be respectful of all of your time and say thank you to everyone for taking time out of their day to come and spend some time thinking about this topic with us, and also to thank the panel, which we'll do in the traditional way in a minute. But before we do, I think we should have one final show of hands. So the questions will be, are you A, more positive, B, less positive, or C, about the same versus when we did the show of hands at the start of this session about this idea? So who has become more positive about this idea through today's conversation?
And I can see you.
Okay, a smallish number of hands. Who has become less positive? More hands. And who has remained about the same? So interesting. So much more to be discussed. Can I ask everyone please to join me in thanking Anna and our panellists for their input today?